It was a warm Saturday morning when everything changed. The sun was shining, and I was looking forward to spending the day working on my truck, an old but reliable pickup that had been in my family for years. As I walked toward the driveway, I noticed something strange. There was an empty space where my truck should have been. My heart dropped. I checked the other side of the street, but it was still missing. I looked around, hoping it was just parked somewhere else, but no, it was gone. That's when I noticed the bright orange sticker on the sidewalk, attached to the nearest sign. Towed for violation of gasoline ban. What? A gasoline ban? What on earth was that? I stood there for a few seconds, unable to process what I was seeing. This wasn't just a normal parking ticket. Someone had taken my truck, and now I was stuck with this baffling notice. I didn't know much about the HOA's rules, beyond the usual restrictions on yard care and noise levels, but a gasoline ban? That was a new one. I looked around, wondering if anyone could give me an explanation, but the neighborhood was quiet. It felt like a nightmare. I grabbed my phone and dialed the number for the HOA office, hoping to get some answers. As the phone rang, I could feel the tension building in my chest. The person who answered the phone was surprisingly calm, as if they had been waiting for my call. "Hello, this is the HOA office. How can I assist you today?" "I'm calling because my truck was towed, and the notice says something about a gasoline ban. Can you explain what that means?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. There was a long pause on the other end. I could tell they were checking something. Then the person spoke again. "I'm afraid I can't give you specific details right now, but I'll have someone from the board contact you soon." "Wait a minute. Someone just took my truck. What do you mean you can't give me any details?" I demanded, my frustration starting to show. "I understand this is frustrating," the person said calmly, "but please understand that this is a matter being handled by the HOA board. Someone will reach out to you shortly." I hung up, my hands shaking. What was going on? I had been living here for years, and never once had I heard about a gasoline ban. Who was behind this, and why was it happening now? That's when I remembered Karen. Karen, the HOA board member, had always rubbed me the wrong way. She seemed to have an answer for everything, but none of them ever made any sense. She'd been in charge of enforcing the rules for as long as I could remember, and if there was any chance that she was behind this strange ban, I was determined to find out. I decided to head over to the HOA office in person. The drive felt longer than usual, and my mind was racing with thoughts of what I'd say. I wasn't one to back down, especially not over something like this. As I approached the office, I saw a familiar face standing by the door. It was Karen, of course. She was chatting with a neighbor, but when she saw me, her smile disappeared. She knew I was coming, and it wasn't going to be a friendly conversation. "Is there something I can help you with?" she asked, her tone dripping with fake sweetness. I didn't waste any time. "You can start by telling me what this gasoline ban is all about. My truck was just towed over it." Her eyes narrowed, and she straightened up. "Ah, so you've heard. The gasoline ban is in place to protect the environment. We can't have vehicles like yours idling in the neighborhood, contributing to pollution." I felt my blood boil. I've lived here for years and never heard a word about this so-called ban. Why didn't anyone tell us? Well, that's because the rules have always been in place, just not strictly enforced until now. You've been given plenty of warnings about the regulations. Perhaps you just didn't notice, she said, barely containing her smug grin. I didn't get any warnings, I shot back. And I certainly didn't know there was a ban on gasoline. You can't just make up rules and enforce them out of nowhere. Karen took a step closer, her eyes gleaming with that all-too-familiar sense of superiority. I'm afraid that's how things work here. The HOA rules are in place for a reason, and we're just doing our job. I was about to respond, but before I could speak, she turned on her heel and walked back into the office, without saying another word. I stood there, stunned. The arrogance was unbelievable. But I wasn't going to let her get away with this. This wasn't just about my truck anymore. It was about standing up to the ridiculous rules that controlled everything we did. If Karen thought she could get away with this, she had another thing coming. I left the office, determined to find out everything I could about this so-called gasoline ban. This wasn't over. Far from it, the drive home felt different that day. I wasn't just driving back to my house, I was driving back with a purpose. The thoughts swirling in my mind were no longer about the truck being towed, they were about something bigger. Something much more frustrating. How could the HOA make up rules like this without any of us knowing? And how could Karen, of all people, get away with enforcing them as if they were the law of the land? The more I thought about it, the more I realized how long this had been going on. The HOA had always been a little too controlling for my liking. It wasn't just the gasoline ban, it was everything. The rules about what color your front door could be, the height of your grass, and even the type of flowers you could plant in your garden. All of it felt like an endless checklist of tiny, petty regulations that were meant to keep everyone in line, even if they made no sense. I parked my car outside my house and sat there for a moment, staring at the empty space where my truck had been just hours ago. I felt a wave of frustration. I had always followed the rules. I kept my lawn neat, I never played loud music, and I always made sure to park my truck in the designated space. So why was I being treated like this? Why was Karen so intent on making my life harder? As I walked inside, I began thinking about the other residents of the neighborhood. It wasn't just me who had to deal with Karen's rules. There were others who had been affected, too. People who didn't dare speak up because they feared retribution or, worse, being kicked out of the neighborhood. I remembered Mr. Thompson, an elderly man who had lived across the street from me for years. He was always polite but had a quiet frustration about him. He had once told me that the HOA was getting worse with every passing year, but he never had the energy to fight back. I never thought much about it until now, but hearing his words in my mind, I knew I wasn't alone in this. And I wasn't about to let Karen and her petty rules go unchallenged. That evening, I decided to take action. I grabbed my phone and started looking up HOA regulations online. What I found didn't make sense. There were a lot of rules about maintaining the appearance of homes, about noise, about pets. But nowhere could I find any mention of a gasoline ban. I started to wonder if Karen had just made it up. But that didn't sit right with me. Karen wasn't the type to make up rules, was she? No, she was too calculated. She always knew exactly what she was doing, and she always seemed to be one step ahead. That thought made me even more determined to get to the bottom of this. The next day, I decided to pay a visit to the local government office. Maybe they had records of any new regulations the HOA had been passing. After all, if this was an official rule, it would have to be recorded somewhere. As I walked into the office, I felt a sense of urgency. I needed answers. I was greeted by a woman at the front desk. She looked up from her computer as I approached. "Can I help you?" she asked politely. "I'm looking for records on any new regulations that might have been passed by the HOA recently." "Specifically, something about a gasoline ban," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The woman furrowed her brow and typed something into her computer. After a moment, she looked up, her expression confused. "I'm afraid I don't see anything like that. We don't have any record of such a regulation in the area." "Are you sure this is something the HOA would have passed?" I nodded, feeling a mix of relief and anger. "I'm positive. They're claiming that my truck was towed because of this ban, but I can't find any evidence that it even exists." She smiled sympathetically. "It sounds like someone is using their position to enforce a rule that isn't even real. I'd suggest you take this up with your local HOA board." I couldn't believe it. Karen had made up the entire thing. This wasn't about the environment, and it certainly wasn't about rules. It was about power. Karen had decided to target me for some unknown reason, and now I had the proof to back it up. I walked out of the office feeling more confident. I had what I needed, but I still needed to figure out what to do next. The thought of confronting Karen directly seemed like a good place to start, but I knew it wasn't going to be easy. Karen didn't back down, especially when she thought she was right. But I wasn't about to let her win. Not this time. As I drove home, I thought about the other people who had dealt with Karen's reign over the neighborhood. People who had been too afraid to speak up. Maybe it was time for that to change. Maybe it was time for someone to stand up and show Karen that she couldn't just make up the rules whenever she felt like it. And that someone was going to be me. The next day, I couldn't sit still. The injustice of it all weighed heavily on my mind. I had proof now. The gasoline ban was nothing but a lie, a fabrication to justify the towing of my truck. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized it wasn't just about me. It was about what was happening to everyone in this neighborhood under Karen's rule. People were being forced to abide by ridiculous, unspoken regulations, and most of them didn't even realize they were being manipulated. I spent the morning gathering my thoughts, organizing the documents I'd gathered about the HOA's rules. I printed out the emails I had exchanged with the office and saved a copy of the towing notice. Armed with my evidence, I set out to find Karen. I wasn't going to let her dodge me this time. I walked over to the HOA office, hoping to catch her during office hours. The door was open, and I could see Karen at her desk, flipping through papers with her usual look of calm superiority. She didn't notice me enter right away, so I stood in the doorway, gathering my courage. Finally, she glanced up and smiled. Well, if it isn't the man of the hour," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "What can I do for you today?" "I think it's time we have a serious conversation about this gasoline ban," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, though anger still simmered beneath the surface. Karen didn't flinch. "I see you've done your homework. You've got a lot of questions, but I assure you, the gasoline ban is in place for a reason. It's not just about the environment, it's about making this neighborhood a cleaner, safer place to live." "Safe?" I scoffed. "You can't be serious. There's no such thing as a gasoline ban, at least not in the HOA's official documents." I checked. "You can't just make up rules and enforce them on your own. I want to know why you towed my truck, and I want a legitimate explanation. Not some vague excuse about the greater good." Her eyes narrowed, but she didn't back down. Instead, she leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "The rules exist to maintain the integrity of this community," she said, her tone taking on a colder edge. "And you, Mr. Johnson, have been violating those rules for months. You just didn't know it." I stared at her, confused. "What are you talking about?" "The gasoline issue isn't just about the fuel," she continued, her voice becoming more calculated. "It's about the way you've been parking your truck. It's been idling in the driveway far too long, running for hours on end. I've had complaints about it from your neighbors. You've been making the neighborhood look bad with your constant engine noise and exhaust fumes." I felt my blood pressure rise as she spoke. This was the justification she had cooked up. She was spinning the story to make it look like my truck was causing all these problems when, in reality, I had parked it in the same spot for years without issue. If anyone had complaints, they were likely about her enforcing some new, unspoken rule that no one knew about. "That's absurd," I said, my voice tightening with frustration. "You've never said anything about complaints. And if there really were complaints, why didn't you bring them to me first? Why did you go straight to towing my truck?" Karen didn't answer right away. She just stared at me with that calm, almost patronizing look she always wore. Finally, she sighed, as if explaining her actions was some great burden. "I've been trying to run this community in a way that's best for everyone," she said slowly, "but some people just don't get it. They don't understand how important it is to maintain order." I was seething now. Maintain order? By making up rules that don't exist and punishing people for things they didn't even know they were doing wrong? "You're out of line, Karen." She stood up from her desk, her posture rigid and defensive. "I'm just trying to keep things in control. If you don't like it, you can always move." The words stung, but they also lit a fire inside me. I wasn't going anywhere. I had every right to be here, and I wasn't going to let her push me around anymore. Move? You think that's the solution? I shook my head in disbelief. No, Karen. The solution is you stepping down and admitting that you've been abusing your power. The HOA isn't your personal kingdom, and you can't just make up rules whenever you feel like it. Karen's eyes flashed with something darker now. You're making a mistake, Mr. Johnson. You have no idea who you're dealing with. I didn't flinch. Maybe I do now, I said, my voice firm. And I'm not going anywhere until this gets fixed. She opened her mouth as if to say something, but I turned and walked out of the office, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew this wasn't over. It was just beginning. I had made up my mind. I was going to take this all the way. I didn't care how much it took. I wasn't going to let Karen keep pushing people around with her made-up rules. It was time for the truth to come out. And it was time for the neighborhood to know exactly what kind of person Karen really was. The conversation with Karen lingered in my mind like a bitter taste I couldn't shake off. Her smug attitude and refusal to acknowledge any wrongdoing only fueled my resolve. I wasn't just going to let this slide. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how important it was for me to not only fight this for myself but for all the other people who had been silenced by her overbearing ways. If I let her get away with this, I'd be doing a disservice to everyone who had quietly accepted her reign. I knew I needed to dig deeper, to find more evidence that could prove Karen had overstepped her boundaries. I spent the next few days asking around, talking to my neighbors without directly mentioning the issue with the gasoline ban. Most people were hesitant to speak out, either out of fear of retaliation or because they didn't want to get involved. But slowly, I managed to find people who had noticed the little things Karen had been doing, small, seemingly insignificant actions that added up over time. Mr. Thompson, the elderly neighbor I'd mentioned earlier, was one of the first people to open up. He had lived in the neighborhood for over 30 years, and he had seen everything. As we sat in his living room one afternoon, he told me about how the HOA had gradually become more controlling under Karen's leadership. He had been fined multiple times for small things, like not trimming his hedge to an exact measurement or leaving a few leaves on his lawn too long. I used to just pay it, he said, his voice heavy with resignation. But after a while, I started noticing a pattern. They were making up fines, hitting people with penalties for the smallest things. The rules kept changing, and they didn't even bother to tell anyone. His words struck me hard. I had suspected that Karen's influence had spread beyond just my situation, but hearing it from someone who had lived here for so long confirmed it. The HOA wasn't just overstepping its bounds, it was taking advantage of its power, using arbitrary rules to manipulate the residents into compliance. I took Mr. Thompson's words to heart, and I started gathering more stories from my neighbors. One woman told me that she had received a fine for parking her car on the street for a few hours, even though she had always parked there. Another neighbor shared how Karen had sent her multiple warnings for the noise violations when, in reality, her children were playing quietly in the backyard. The more I learned, the more I realized how deep this problem ran. Karen wasn't just making up a gasoline ban, she had been exploiting the HOA's rules to intimidate and control people for years. It wasn't just me who had been affected, everyone had been living under the thumb of someone who had no regard for fairness. The next step was to get official records. If Karen had been making up rules and fining people without following proper procedures, then there had to be a paper trail somewhere. I headed to the local town hall to request access to the public records of the HOA's meetings and any updates to the regulations. After a bit of back and forth with the clerk, I managed to get a copy of the HOA's meeting minutes for the last few years. As I sifted through the documents, I found exactly what I was looking for. There was no mention of a gasoline ban. There was no mention of any new rule that could justify Karen's actions. It was all just the same old regulations, rules that were vague enough to give her the power to punish anyone who stepped out of line. Armed with this evidence, I knew it was time to take action. But I wasn't going to just confront Karen again. This time, I was going to make sure the whole neighborhood knew what she had been doing. I started organizing a small group of neighbors who were willing to stand up against Karen's tactics. Mr. Thompson agreed to join me, and a few others who had been affected by Karen's overreach also pledged their support. Together, we formed a small but determined group, ready to fight for fairness. We began meeting in secret, discussing our strategy, and making sure we had all the evidence we needed. We planned to attend the next HOA board meeting, where we would confront Karen and the rest of the board members with our findings. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how important this moment was. This wasn't just about getting my truck back, it was about taking down an unjust system that had been allowed to fester for far too long. The day of the meeting arrived, and the tension was palpable. We all knew that this would be the moment of truth. As I walked into the HOA office with my small group of supporters, I could feel the weight of what we were about to do. Karen was already there, sitting at the head of the table, her eyes scanning the room with that familiar, calculating look. But today, she wasn't in control. Today, we were. I took a deep breath, gathered my papers, and prepared to confront her. The battle was about to begin. The room fell silent as I stepped forward with my group of neighbors behind me. Karen sat at the head of the table, her usual smug expression now tinged with a hint of nervousness as she noticed the determined look in our eyes. I had never seen her like this before, and it felt like the first real crack in her armor. I wasted no time. "Karen," I began, my voice steady but firm. "I've been looking through the HOA's records, and I've come to a simple conclusion. There is no gasoline ban in this neighborhood. No such rule has ever been passed or even discussed at any of the HOA meetings in the past several years." The room was quiet. I could feel Karen's eyes on me, narrowing with suspicion. She hadn't expected me to come armed with evidence. She hadn't expected any of this. I pulled out the meeting minutes I had gathered from the town hall, the ones that clearly showed no mention of the so-called gasoline ban. I placed them on the table in front of her, making sure everyone could see the documents. These are the official records of the HOA's meetings. Not a single word about any rule banning gasoline or anything remotely similar. You've been making this up as you go along. Karen's face flushed red as she glanced down at the papers, her mouth opening and closing as if she were searching for the right words to defend herself. But there were no words. She had no defense. She had lied. "Is this true, Karen?" one of my neighbors, Mrs. Patterson, asked, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and disbelief. "Have you been making up these rules to punish people?" Karen didn't respond right away. She sat there, fuming silently, her eyes darting from the papers to the group of us gathered around the table. It was clear that she hadn't prepared for this kind of confrontation. For the first time, she was the one on the defensive. "I don't know what you think you're doing," Karen finally said, her voice cold and calculating. "But you can't just come in here and accuse me of making up rules. I've been trying to keep this neighborhood in order, and I won't be intimidated by a bunch of complaints." I stepped forward, my patience worn thin. "It's not about complaints, Karen. It's about the truth. You can't just fabricate rules and impose them on people without anyone questioning you. You've been abusing your power for too long, and today, that ends." Another neighbor, Mr. Walker, chimed in. "We've all had enough of your overbearing tactics. You fined people for things that aren't even violations. You've targeted people like they were criminals, just for living their lives. We won't stand for it anymore." I could see the others nodding in agreement, their eyes filled with a mix of anger and relief. They weren't just there for me anymore, they were there for themselves, too. They were there to put an end to the toxic control that Karen had over this neighborhood. Karen's eyes flickered with something close to fear, but she quickly regained her composure. "You're all making a mistake," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I was just doing my job. I was trying to protect this neighborhood from the people who don't care about the rules." "Protect?" I said, incredulous. "You weren't protecting anyone. You were using the HOA to push your own agenda and punish anyone who didn't fit into your narrow vision of what this neighborhood should be." Another neighbor, Mrs. Shaw, spoke up. My daughter was fined for planting flowers that were too bright. You're going to tell me that was about protecting the neighborhood? Karen looked around the room, her face growing darker with each word. The people she had once silenced were speaking out now, and the power she held seemed to be slipping away, little by little. We're done with you, Mr. Thompson, the elderly neighbor said in a firm, steady voice. We're taking this to the next level. We'll be reporting you to the local authorities if necessary. You've gone too far, and the damage you've caused is too great to ignore. The room fell quiet again as Karen's expression hardened. I could see the anger in her eyes, but I also saw something else, something that looked a lot like fear. She knew she was losing control. The truth was finally out, and there was no way to cover it up anymore. I don't have to listen to this, Karen snapped, standing up abruptly. You're all wasting my time. I'm still in charge here, and I will make sure you all pay the price for this insubordination. But her words held no weight anymore. The group of neighbors who had been too afraid to speak out now had the truth on their side, and we weren't going to back down. I stood tall, my voice unwavering. You may think you're in charge, but not anymore. We're taking this to the people. The whole neighborhood will know what you've been doing, and they'll make their own decision. This is the end of your reign, Karen. She didn't say anything else. She just glared at us, her face red with rage, before storming out of the room. As the door slammed behind her, the tension in the room began to lift. The air felt lighter, and for the first time in a long while, it felt like we had a real chance to make a change. We had exposed the truth, and the next steps were clear. It wasn't over yet, but we had won the first battle. We stood together in the room, united. The power that Karen once held over us was gone, and now it was our turn to take back control. The atmosphere in the HOA office was charged with energy after Karen stormed out. We stood there for a moment, taking in what had just happened. The room felt different, lighter, more open. But we knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. We had made our stand, and Karen had retreated in defeat, but that didn't mean she was going to give up quietly. I had a feeling this was far from over. And yet, there was a part of me that felt a sense of relief, as if a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. We had finally stood up for ourselves. We had finally fought back. But the reality of the situation soon settled in. As the group began to disperse, Mr. Thompson caught my eye. He motioned for me to follow him outside. I stepped out of the office and joined him on the sidewalk. Good work in there, son, he said, his voice warm and approving. You've got fire, that's for sure. But don't get too comfortable. Karen's not going to let this slide. She'll fight back, and she'll try to make it personal. I nodded, taking in his words. Mr. Thompson had seen it all before. He had lived through enough HOA battles to know how these things played out. You're right, I said. But we have the truth on our side. That counts for something. He smiled faintly. It does, but don't underestimate Karen. She'll do anything to keep her control. The HOA is her kingdom, and she doesn't like to lose. Stay on your toes. I could feel the tension building in my chest again. It was one thing to stand up to someone like Karen, but it was another thing entirely to take on the full weight of her wrath. But I couldn't back down now. Not after everything that had happened. The days that followed were tense. I kept my eyes and ears open, waiting for Karen's next move. It didn't take long. A few days after the confrontation, I received a letter in the mail from the HOA, signed by Karen herself. It was a formal notice that I was being fined for violating HOA regulations, including a failure to comply with neighborhood standards. I felt a mix of anger and disbelief as I read the letter. Karen was trying to retaliate, using the same petty tactics that had made her so insufferable in the first place. But this time it wasn't going to work. I wasn't going to back down. I immediately gathered my evidence, again, and called a meeting with the group of neighbors who had been supporting me. We were going to take this to the next level. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about all of us standing together and making sure Karen couldn't get away with her manipulation any longer. The day of the next HOA meeting arrived, and I was ready. We all were. The group met outside the office, a mix of nerves and determination on everyone's faces. But we had something important on our side now: unity. We weren't going to let Karen divide us or intimidate us anymore. When we walked into the room, Karen was already seated, her cold gaze directed at us. But this time, she didn't seem so confident. There was a palpable sense of tension, and I could tell she was on edge. I stood in front of the group, my voice steady. We're here today to make it clear that we're not going to stand for these false fines or your abuse of power, Karen. You've been targeting people for no reason other than your desire to control this neighborhood. We won't let that continue. Karen opened her mouth to speak, but I raised my hand to stop her. This time, it's not just about my truck. We've heard from other residents who've been targeted by you for trivial violations, and we have the evidence to prove it. I pulled out the stack of documents we had been gathering over the past few days: complaints, emails, fines, and meeting minutes that clearly showed Karen's overreach. As I laid the papers down in front of her, I could see the color drain from her face. We demand that these fines be rescinded immediately and that you step down from your position on the board, I said, my voice unwavering. You have lost the support of the neighborhood, and it's time for the truth to come to light. The room was silent. For a moment, it felt like the world had stopped. Karen looked around the room, her eyes wide, her shoulders tense. She could feel the shift in the room. The power that she had so easily wielded was slipping away, piece by piece. I won't step down, Karen stammered, but there was a crack in her voice now. I've worked hard for this neighborhood, and you have no right to undermine me like this. Hard? You've made life harder for everyone who's tried to live by the rules you've set, Karen. The only thing you've worked hard at is controlling people who didn't deserve it, I said, my words sharp and clear. This isn't about work. It's about fairness, about standing up for what's right. A few of the other neighbors spoke up in support of me. We're with him, Mr. Thompson said. We've had enough. The HOA isn't your personal kingdom, Karen. It's about serving the community, not ruling it. There was no longer any room for doubt. The board members who had once backed Karen were now looking around nervously. They could see that the truth was out, and they knew the community had turned against Karen's tyranny. The moment of truth had come, and Karen knew it. The fight wasn't over yet, but we had won the most important battle. We had shown that we would not be silenced. We would no longer allow Karen's petty rules and manipulations to destroy the harmony of our community. The end was near for Karen's reign over the HOA. And I knew, deep down, that it wouldn't be long before the entire neighborhood would be free from her control. The moment Karen stormed out of the HOA office that day, I knew the battle wasn't over. The confrontation had shaken her, but she wasn't going to go down quietly. She had too much pride, and her grip on power was something she wasn't ready to release just yet. However, the cracks were starting to show, and it was only a matter of time before the truth spread like wildfire throughout the neighborhood. The news spread quickly. Residents began talking to each other, sharing what had happened at the meeting, and the word about Karen's manipulation started to get out. More and more people came forward with their own stories, telling me about the fines they had been hit with for the smallest of things, fines that never seemed to make sense. Some had been penalized for excessive yard decorations, others for keeping their front porch lights on a little too late. Some were even fined for things that weren't violations at all. The more stories I heard, the more furious I became. This wasn't just about my truck being towed. It was about a woman who had taken advantage of her position, using fear and intimidation to control people. The damage she had caused to this community, to the lives of the people who had trusted the HOA to be fair, was immeasurable. I could feel the momentum building. What started as a single confrontation with Karen was now a community-wide movement. People were finally standing up to her, not just because of the lies about the gasoline ban, but because they were tired of living in fear of her whims. But it wasn't just the residents who were speaking out. The local news got wind of the story, and soon enough, Karen's name was being mentioned on local television. The reporter interviewed several residents who shared their experiences with the HOA's overreach, and the public backlash began to snowball. Karen's reputation, once untouchable, was now in tatters. The public had seen the truth, and they weren't willing to let her get away with it anymore. I could see the writing on the wall. The community was no longer under Karen's control. People had found their voices, and they were demanding change. And it wasn't just about me anymore, it was about everyone who had been wronged by her unfair rule. But I knew we still had one final hurdle to overcome. Karen wasn't just going to step down willingly. She wasn't going to hand over the power without a fight. I had to make sure that once and for all, we would rid ourselves of her influence and restore fairness to the HOA. The resolution. The final HOA meeting arrived, and this time, the stakes were higher than ever. With the public outcry growing louder and more residents coming forward, I knew this was the moment that would decide everything. It was time to put an end to Karen's reign once and for all. As we gathered outside the HOA office, the air was thick with anticipation. The group of neighbors who had supported me throughout this journey stood with me, their faces a mix of nervousness and determination. Today, we weren't just fighting for fairness, we were fighting for the future of our neighborhood. Karen was already inside when we arrived, seated at the head of the table, as always. But this time, the room felt different. The energy was charged. It was no longer just about enforcing rules, it was about taking back control from someone who had abused their power for far too long. I stepped forward and addressed the room. We're here today to make one thing clear, Karen's reign of unfairness, manipulation, and fear is over. We've gathered evidence, we've heard the stories of every person she's wronged, and it's time for this to end. Karen stood up immediately, her face flushed with anger. This is ridiculous. You have no right to make accusations against me, she shouted, trying to regain some semblance of control. I didn't back down. The people you've hurt, the people you've bullied into submission, are finally speaking up. You can't silence us anymore. The board members, who had once been too intimidated to speak out, now looked uncomfortable in their seats. They could see the tide turning, and they knew it. The power was slipping from Karen's hands. One by one, the neighbors who had joined me began to speak. They told their stories of how Karen had fined them for trivial offenses, how she had used her position to control them, and how she had manipulated the rules to suit her own needs. Each person's story was a blow to Karen's credibility. The more we spoke, the more we exposed her for what she truly was, a power-hungry individual who had been using the HOA to push her own agenda. I could see Karen's face redden with each accusation. She tried to argue, but her words were no longer convincing. The community had seen the truth, and they weren't buying her excuses anymore. As the stories piled up, her position became increasingly untenable. Finally, the board member spoke. We've heard enough, one of them said, his voice unsteady. Karen, we can't continue to support you after everything that's come to light. We're suspending you from your position as a board member, and we'll be investigating your actions thoroughly. The room erupted into applause. The weight of the moment was indescribable. For the first time in years, the HOA wasn't being run by fear. The people had spoken, and the truth had won out. Karen's face twisted with fury, but there was nothing she could do now. Her power had been stripped away, and the neighborhood was free from her control. As she was escorted out of the meeting, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. It was over. The fight was won. The life lesson. As the dust settled and the HOA began the process of rebuilding, I reflected on everything that had happened. The journey had been long, full of frustration, anger, and doubt. But it had also been a journey of growth. I had learned the power of standing up for what was right, even when it felt impossible. I had seen how the truth could dismantle a system built on lies and manipulation. I realized that, more than anything, this fight wasn't just about taking down a corrupt HOA board member. It was about standing up for each other. It was about refusing to let fear and intimidation dictate the way we lived our lives. And most importantly, it was about reclaiming our power as a community. The lesson was simple but profound: when we stand together, we are stronger than any force that tries to divide us. We may not always win every battle, but if we fight for what's right, we can change the world around us. I looked around at my neighbors, people who had once been too afraid to speak out, but who had found the courage to stand with me in the end. We had won more than just the battle for fairness, we had won back our sense of community. As I walked back to my house that evening, I couldn't help but smile. The fight had been hard, but the victory was worth it. And as I looked around at the neighborhood, I knew that, together, we had made it a better place for everyone.